Boa noite a todos, boa noite a todas. Damos início hoje a mais um webinar realizado em parceria pela Universidade Católica Dom Bosco e a Comissão de Direito Digital e Startup da OBMS. Hoje recebendo a visita do professor Ryan Abbott, que vai falar sobre o tema O Robô Justo, Inteligência Artificial e a Lei. Conosco presentes aqui também a doutora Luísa Fatim, nossa coordenadora de pesquisa e eventos. E esse é um evento para a gente bem interessante, porque além de ser o nosso primeiro evento internacional, traz uma temática que é extremamente instigante, relacionada ao uso da inteligência artificial dentro do direito. Temos um palestrante extremamente gabaritado, a Luísa, na oportunidade correta, trará aí o seu currículo. E esse é só mais um dos eventos que estão sendo promovidos pela Comissão de Direito Digital da OBMS. A OCDB tem sido uma grande parceira, cedendo o espaço para que a gente possa realizar esses eventos, esses webinars, palestras, debates. Então, aqui já fica registrado o nosso agradecimento à coordenação do curso de Direito, à Pró-Reitoria de Graduação e a toda a equipe que tem nos apoiado. Na oportunidade, pessoal, quero aproveitar rapidinho para lembrar para vocês que a Comissão de Direito Digital está realizando uma campanha do agasalho. Estamos arrecadando cobertores, agasalhos, roupas, calçados, pelúcias, tudo que vocês puderem doar e que esteja em condição de ser doado para ajudar aí nossos irmãos na Clínica da Alma. O pessoal está lá esperando as nossas doações. O frio promete ser bem severo agora no mês de julho. Então, quem puder colaborar, toda doação será bem-vinda. Nós estamos recebendo essas doações na sala do Litec, na sede da OBMS, lá na Mato Grosso. Então, agradecemos a todos. Outra coisinha, vocês devem estar percebendo aí no cantinho da tela de vocês um QR Code. Esse QR Code é o que vai garantir a presença de vocês. Ele fica disponível só até às 19 horas. Então, vocês podem, a partir da leitura desse QR Code, registrar a presença para que vocês possam ter direito à certificação desse evento. E uma última recomendação, o professor Ryan Abbott, nesse momento, está em Londres e a palestra será em inglês. Então, quem puder, estiver assistindo, acompanhando, dentro aí do YouTube, acione o recurso da legenda em português para poder compreender algumas coisas que, eventualmente, vocês não possam captar. Mas essa é uma palestra internacional, senhores, então é uma excelente oportunidade de vocês praticarem o inglês de vocês. Muito obrigado a todos que estão nos assistindo, muito obrigado a todos que estão aqui presentes, prestigiando. Passo a palavra, então, à doutora Luísa Fatim, para que faça a apresentação do nosso palestrante. Abre o microfone.
Boa noite a todos, meu nome é Luísa Fatim, eu sou advogada. Pessoal, somos extremamente sortudos de ter aqui conosco o professor Ryan Abbott, que é tão ocupado. O currículo dele é de fato impressionante. Ele não só é autor de um livro fabuloso que eu tive o privilégio de ler, The Reasonable Robot, mas ele é professor de Direito e Ciências na Faculdade de Direito da Universidade de Surrey, professor de Medicina na David Geffen School of Medicine da UCLA, é mediador, é árbitro, autor de livros, publica amplamente sobre questões ligadas à inteligência artificial, às ciências da vida, propriedade intelectual, publica em revistas jurídicas, médicas e científicas, e inclusive sua pesquisa tem sido destaque na mídia internacional, incluindo o New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Financial Times. Então, somos muito sortudos. Agora ele está em Londres, 23h30 por lá, quase na hora de dormir, e topou falar com a gente sobre esse tema que é tão incipiente aqui no Brasil. Professor Ryan, thank you once again for being with Brazilian lawyers and students. I told the public about your amazing resume and said that you're in London, almost bedtime, and agreed to talk to us about this subject that is so full of intricacies and whose discussion in Brazil is, as you know, very incipient. I also said that I'm looking forward to the translation of your book to Portuguese, as I only had access to it in English, as I told you earlier. But I would very much like to see your research translated to Portuguese so our students, our law students, could have access to it. Let's start with a description of your book and then jump to your amazing presentation. What is the reasonable robot about?
Well, thank you. And it's really a great pleasure to be here. And I wish I was in Brazil to be doing this in person with all of you. And travel has returned to the US and England. So hopefully soon we can all be together. But the reasonable robot is looking at ways in which machines are behaving like people and how the law really isn't made to accommodate that sort of thing, and what sorts of rules we ought to have to help us get the most social benefits from technologies like artificial intelligence. Sorry, should I just start the lecture now, or was the...
Yes, so I'm sorry, Professor. I guess we have a bit of lag here, just a few seconds. Yeah, and I had the opportunity to read your book, and we have here live with us several members of our Commission of Digital Law in our Brazilian Bar Association. As I told you earlier, we are members of the OAB Mato Grosso do Sul. It's like the American Bar Association, but from a very specific state, the state of Pantanal, which is Mato Grosso do Sul. So yeah, we can start your presentation now. We're looking forward. And as you said earlier, I hope we can get you to Brazil to talk to us in person. As a matter of fact, we're having a symposium, a congress here in September. So let's see about that.
That would be lovely. All right, well, I will do a bit of a slideshow here. So I'll try and speak for around, I guess at this point, 40 minutes to leave some time for Q&A. And to start with an example from Google. So this is a video describing a research project done by a team at Google, which involved creating a deep reinforcement learning based artificial intelligence system that could automate chip floor planning. Chip floor planning is how components on a microchip are arranged. And it is important because the manner in which the components are arranged affects how a microchip functions. For example, what the latency will be or how much electricity the chip uses. So it's an important part of the R&D process for companies like Intel that design microchips. And traditionally, making a new chip floor plan takes months of time by an interdisciplinary team of people. But the team at Google reported the AI could make a new chip floor plan in less than 6 hours, and the AI design chips outperformed the human design chips on all key performance indicators. Excuse me. That sort of thing, having a machine automate something that is traditionally done by a group of people is going to have a profound effect economically because chip designs are something that have a lot of commercial importance, and socially, it may be rendering teams of people technologically unemployed, and legally for a bunch of reasons I'm interested in exploring with you. None of this has gone unnoticed by policymakers. The United Kingdom last year released its national AI strategy, noting that we are all living in the age of artificial intelligence, that it is a technology that has perhaps one of the greatest potentials to profoundly disrupt British culture, British life economically, socially, and in many other ways. And that now is the time for governments to be taking industrial action to promote artificial intelligence. But it isn't just reports and talk. Some jurisdictions are coming out with new rules designed specifically with artificial intelligence in mind. Of course, AI already does a lot, and there are already a host of rules that govern AI behavior, just not rules designed with AI in mind. The European Commission last year put out a draft set of AI regulations, and these are laws that would specifically target development and use of AI. It completely prohibits certain uses of AI, for example, citizen scoring, where an AI is used to give you a score for how trustworthy a citizen you are, like credit scoring. For mass facial recognition in public places, although there are some exceptions for that, or for deceptive techniques involving advertising. For high-risk uses of AI, there's almost a medical device compliance regime where you have to do a bunch of regulatory work up front to get approval before you can put a device on the market. And then for lower risk or no risk uses, there are more, or sometimes more compliance burdens after something is on the market. So policymakers are now moving from talk to action. But what hasn't been appreciated so much, again, is that there are already many laws that govern things like AI, and that these laws may not work well when you have a machine doing the sort of thing that only a person used to do. And I think the best way to illustrate that is to look at a couple of areas where this applies, and I'd like to talk about tax, tort, and patents, and IP. IP is one of the areas where I focus the most. And the book argues, and I argue, that perhaps counterintuitively, people do better when the law does less to discriminate between AI and human behavior. So let's see why that is. And tax might not be the first sort of thing that you think about when you think about robots taking people's jobs, but it is an important component of it. And this is not a new debate. It's been here long since before the chip floor planning example, at least since the first industrial revolution, where in Britain you had a social movement aimed at preventing automation and sometimes engaging in violent displays of machine breaking. It has turned out that though machines have put people out of work, in the long term, there has tended to be increased productivity and decreased unemployment, as the people rendered unemployed have gone on to find new types of work. We have not always done the best job of transitioning people put out of work into new job types, but the history of automation is one in which we both get more productivity and lower unemployment. For example, at the turn of the 19th century, about 40% of the workforce worked in agriculture in the United States, and now only 3% does. But we don't have a 40% unemployment rate, and agriculture has never been more productive. Fewer people are able to do a lot more with, among other things, the existence of machinery that can help with farming. So in the future, it might be the same. AI may get very good at some things and put chip floor planners out of business, but not other things. And I'm sure those people can find new things to do. Or it might be that AI just starts getting so good at things generally that there is a limit to the number of things that people can do that AI can't. And we do have widespread unemployment. It's hard to predict the future, but in either case, the best sort of solution to either scenario is largely focused on the government providing people with job training to get them into new fields, and with providing enhanced social benefits like medical care and unemployment wages, so that the people who are put out of work don't suffer disproportionately. But one of the reasons for automating, besides the fact that a machine might do a better job than someone in a particular task, is actually tax policy. At least in the United States and the United Kingdom, there are all sorts of reasons why an employer does better having a machine do a job from a tax perspective than having a person do that job. So if you've been in the United States recently, you will be used to walking into a McDonald's and seeing an automated cash register or teller, being operated by a computer where you can give your order. And that teller is essentially doing the same job as a human teller. But in the United States, to employ a human teller, the business McDonald's has to pay the government for the privilege of employing them. We call them payroll taxes, and they make up about 33% of all federal revenue. And the employee and the employer, depending on someone's income band, both have to make payments towards this, and it is for some of the social benefits that they receive. But if McDonald's can get a machine to do the same thing as a person, even if they are otherwise essentially interchangeable, then McDonald's is encouraged to do so because they have to pay less in taxes. And there's other reasons they have to pay less in taxes. They're just a bit more complicated, and they're in the book, and you probably don't want to hear them. But the point is, Even if a person and a machine are doing an interchangeable task, we encourage businesses to automate because they save on taxes. Not only that, automation decreases tax revenue unless all the people rendered unemployed find comparable sorts of work, quickly. And that's because almost all tax income in the United States and in the United Kingdom is based on labor taxes. So in the United States, about 50% of taxes are based on personal income, which largely come from labor. About 33% come from payroll taxes. Less than 10% come from corporate taxes. So when McDonald's puts that cash register person out of work, the government loses the amount of money, not only that they were getting in payroll taxes, but that person was paying in their personal income taxes. And even if McDonald's becomes a little bit more profitable, a relatively small amount of that profit is remitted in taxes because businesses have much lower statutory tax rates and effective tax rates. So not only do tax policies encourage businesses to automate, but they decrease government revenue at a time when the government needs to be spending more money to help people who are rendered unemployed. So how could the law deal with something like that? Well, several years ago, Bill Gates suggested we could tax robots. And that does have some appeal in that it would create a neutral playing field. And so businesses would only automate if it was socially productive and the government wouldn't lose out on revenue. But taxing robots literally would be a very difficult thing to do because it's hard to define a robot for the tax purposes. Robots may not replace people on a one-to-one basis, and it would penalize businesses that are legitimately more efficient with fewer human employees. So perhaps a better way, once the machines start doing a lot of the labor, is to change the way that we tax capital, historically machines, versus labor, historically people. Historically, we have taxed labor more than capital because we have believed that capital will leave jurisdictions that's too heavily taxed. So if the US taxes businesses too much, they'll move to Brazil. But if you tax your citizens too much, not that many of them are going to move to Brazil. That's kind of the dominant economic narrative, but it's been a questionable one for years. And it may be that as the situation changes with technology being used, we really need to restructure how our tax system works. So if you taxed McDonald's rather than the employees at McDonald's, that would stop them from automating to save on taxes, and it would protect government revenue. But it isn't just robots working at McDonald's. They're doing all sorts of things that people used to do, including things like driving cars that cause harm. And people are often concerned and scared of the idea of driving in a self-driving car. There have already been accidents caused by them and fatalities caused by them. The first one, I think, in 2018 in Arizona, where a self-driving car collided with a pedestrian crossing an unmarked, unlit section of the street late at night. There was also a backup driver who was watching a movie on her phone. So there was a lot of blame to go around for that accident, but nothing that makes it okay for the car to miss a pedestrian and cause a fatality. But one of the interesting things about self-driving cars is that they are probably already safer in most conditions than most human drivers. They log more miles without a serious accident than human drivers do. And most of the technologists think that pretty soon these cars are going to be safer than most people most of the time in all situations. But like with tax, we have two different legal systems for accidents caused by machines and accidents caused by people, at least in the United States and the United Kingdom. If a person runs you over late at night, we look at this under a negligence regime, and we ask, would a reasonable human driver have caused that accident? And if the answer is yes, a reasonable person would have caused the accident, then you, the driver, are not liable. And if a reasonable human driver would not have caused the accident, then you, the human driver, are liable. But when a machine causes an accident, like a self-driving car, even if it's doing exactly the same thing as a human driver, we have a strict liability regime, which is a higher standard of liability. It asks whether there was a defect in the machine or with its marketing or advertising. And if so, then there is liability if there is causation. So regardless of the presence of reasonable care. In other words, if Uber, which is trying to automate, has a self-driving car that hits you, you are more likely to have that car be liable than with a human Uber driver who hits you. So, I have someone's mic come on. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, Professor, just a second, excuse me. Our students are without simultaneous translation, and they asked us to ask you if you could speak just a little bit more slowly, please, if possible. And since I just interrupted you, I just wanted to say that our country here ranks 138th in business opening. The World Bank ranking considers indicators such as credit and tax payments. We have so many labor taxes in Brazil, it's almost impractical to be an entrepreneur. Believe me, I tried. Our data shows that almost 50% of companies close within 3 years in Brazil.
Well, then I'm glad
we
you have.
We must invest in robots and try to escape from taxes in capital and in employers.
So I'm glad you're raising another generation of lawyers to help businesses figure out these complex tax rules. And it is good that there's more work for lawyers, but I do suppose that makes it even more appealing to automate.
Yeah.
And I will
exactly. It makes it much more appealing.
You know, last time I was in Brazil, which was just before COVID, I was a little surprised to see that when I went into a commercial building, that it had an elevator operator, because we have not had those where I am since before my time. So it can go in both ways, that you have laws that either encourage a business to automate to avoid complying with employment laws, which is something that is really not good for everyone, or you have laws that keep a machine from doing a job it could do much better than a person, which is also not good because it causes waste, and you have people who could be doing things that machines couldn't do, and we could have more productivity. And so you see kind of in both ways the laws can work to keep things from working smoothly. So with the car,
we could employ these people in other areas.
Precisely. It's a job that you don't need someone to do, that a machine could do cheaply and easily, and then everyone would be better off.
And with less taxes, hopefully.
And with less taxes. If we were making more, hopefully there would be less taxes. We have to have the machines figuring out how to spend the money, but we'll get there.
Yes, I'll get you to it. I'll let you go back. I'm sorry, just...
No, it's more fun to have these interactive, and it is challenging to do them like that by Zoom or online. But when we come for the September conference, it will be easier.
Yeah, I promise.
With the car example, so again, you have these two tiers, and that's not a good system because it again tells Uber, we're not going to pick a person over a machine because it does a better job. We're going to pick a person over a machine because we'll have less liability. And, if the machines are actually safer than people, then that's definitely not a system you want, because you want a law system that is going to encourage the safer option. Now, at some point, the AI is going to improve so much that it almost doesn't matter what standard we hold the machines to, because they will cause so few accidents. Right now, we have about 30,000 people a year who die in the United States from car accidents every year. And many self-driving car experts believe that self-driving cars will essentially never cause accidents once they continue to improve. And at that point, the real dangerous thing on the road isn't the self-driving cars or the people, it's just the people. And then we have a new problem, which is, what do you do about human driving in a world where it's reasonable for people to automate and they choose not to? Well, Elon Musk thinks that we should ban human driving, which has some safety appeal. But if you ban people from doing anything they couldn't do as well as a machine that could cause harm, that really has the potential to limit human freedom and autonomy. And so perhaps the better solution is, again, to have a more neutral playing field and to just hold people and machines to the same tort standard. So while human drivers are the norm, you ask, would a reasonable human driver have caused an accident? Regardless of whether the accident is caused by an AI, like a self-driving Tesla, or a person. And that way, if a machine falls beneath the standard of a person, the owner of the machine, like Tesla, would be liable for it. Meanwhile, when we get to the point where machines become the standard way to drive, we ask, well, this accident you caused, would a reasonable artificial intelligence have caused it? Meaning essentially, the standard machine that is being used. And so if you as a human driver cause an accident that a self-driving Tesla wouldn't have caused, then we will hold you liable for it. And that is a little unfair to you in that it penalizes you no matter how hard you try, because you could never drive as well as a self-driving car at some point. But it is more fair to the people who you injure because you choose to engage in activities that could be done safely by machines. And it is not just driving cars. The FDA, a couple of years ago now, already approved, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, already approved the first autonomous diagnostic AI. So most AI, when it is used in medicine, will give information to a physician. Like if you go to the emergency room and they take your heart readings, they will tell you, the machine will tell a doctor, there is some concerning activity for a heart attack, but you are the doctor, you make the decision. Well, these new devices diagnose a patient with a couple of diseases, so they automate the role of a human doctor. And it is another very interesting sort of questions, what human doctors should be doing when machines can do a better job than they can, whether this is diagnosing someone or treating someone. It may be soon that when you go in to see the doctor to have a cancer removed, the doctor says, well, I can do it or the machine can do it. But if the machine does it, it's going to take a third the time. You'll have fewer side effects and you're more likely to have a successful operation. Not only do I think humans and machines in this case should be held to the same standard of liability, but it may even be unethical for human doctors to do work that a machine could do much safer. So if machines are going to replace us working at McDonald's, driving cars, and practicing medicine, that means we'll get to be creative all day, which is good news, except that machines can also be creative. This is a picture of a Soviet mainframe from the 1960s that researchers claimed was making music. And if you haven't heard some of the very early AI music, I have, and it is awful. You would only ever listen to it for the novelty of a machine having made music. But AI has improved, and so has its ability to make music. And if you go to the Open AI Jukebox initiative now, you can hear that AI has made music in the style of famous human artists, some recently deceased and some still living. And it's not terribly good, but it's also no longer terrible. It's almost sounds like something that Elvis Presley or Frank Sinatra wrote. And it may be in 5 or 10 years that the AI can make something that is indistinguishable from something Elvis Presley made. And it may even be in time that the AI makes better things in the style of Elvis Presley than Elvis ever made. This is concerning enough for a UK actors union called Equity to launch a campaign to stop AI from stealing the show. And their concern is that music and movie studios are increasingly using AI to do work, and that actors are not going to be adequately compensated for the use of their style and likeness and image. And not just making music, AI has made art for a long time. This is a piece of art made by an AI called Aaron, together with its human creator, Harold Cohen, in the 1980s. And this, to me, could be made by anyone, although I'm not a particularly good art critic. AI making art, no one seemed to care until a few years ago when someone spent $500,000 on this piece of artwork, which was marketed by Christie's, a large auction house, as a piece of artwork made by AI. Suddenly, something that was being done essentially academically now had a commercial market. And these days, there are dozens of AI tools online that make very good art, far better than anything I could make, almost instantly, some of which will offer to sell you the copyright in the works, which raises a whole other series of interesting questions about how the law treats creative and inventive activity by a person versus a machine. Just as policymakers have been interested in AI generally, IP offices have been interested in these questions and have held public consultations on them. The US PTO did the first recent one in 2019 and decided nothing needed to change. But it's all sorts of areas, not just AI making creative and inventive stuff. I made this, which could be a trademark for my book, at brandmark.io. And I made it in about 15 seconds, just typing in a few words, and 100 potential trademarks came up. These could be copywritten, but they could also be marks that I could use in commerce. And not only can AI generate trademarks, AI searches to see if other people are using trademarks or if there's confusion. And AI even buys things online for you, like Alexa or Siri in the United States can buy goods for you. And AI sells good on online marketplaces like Amazon. So even things like trademarks are changing now that AI is both a buyer and a seller of goods, and as trademarks are designed to designate the source and origin of commercial goods and not to cause confusion. And it will be interesting questions what that means when the confusion is had by AI like Alexa and Siri. The UK IPO launched a consultation on this also, and is now having their second consultation about to be released, where they are focused on AI making copyrightable things, patentable things, and text and data mining exceptions to copyright infringement. And new sorts of things are being enabled by AI, not just AI doing human sorts of things. So Clearview is a company that develops facial recognition technology for law enforcement, and it is apparently extremely effective at doing that. And it has been trained on 10 billion photographs from the internet. If you use Facebook or Instagram or any of those products, Clearview can probably identify you and provide social media pictures and their context to law enforcement about you. And that raises all sorts of interesting questions, including ones about IP and whether that is copyright infringement. These questions have also taken an international stage at organizations like WIPO, which is the UN agency on IP, because it is important to have a harmonized intellectual property system. If you have a best-selling song you make in Brazil, you want it to be protected in Brazil as well as America, as well as Britain. On the other hand, different countries have different interests in things like access to medicines, and not every country is going to be generating a lot of AI output. Not every country will be leading the AI arms race. Some will be recipients of AI-generated content. With respect to making artistic works, there isn't a whole lot of law on the subject, but the United Kingdom was the first country in 1988 to provide for protection for computer-generated works. And those are works made by a machine such that there is no traditional human author. The United States, on the other hand, has gone in the opposite direction, and since 1973 has rejected works of art not made with a traditional human author. And they cite in support of that case to some Supreme Court cases in the 19th century, which held that, content for which copyright subsists comes from the mind of an author. And so the Copyright Office has decided that machines don't have minds and therefore there can't be protection. That policy has not yet been challenged in court, although there was almost a case that challenged it, which was Naruto v. Slater. And that involved these monkey selfies, which were pictures a monkey took of itself. And the photographer tried to take copyright in the photograph. Sorry, the person who owned the camera tried to take a copyright in the photograph. That photographer was sued by PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, saying that the monkey should own the copyright. And that case was ultimately dismissed but not based on the copyrightability of the image. It was based on the fact that in the United States, monkeys can't bring lawsuits. My research group is doing some legal advocacy and challenging that US policy in court. It is easier in the United States because the US registers copyright. Many other jurisdictions do not, so you'd have to have an infringement lawsuit. But this was an AI-generated piece of artwork from 2012 or 14, and the Copyright Office refused to issue it. So we have recently filed a complaint in federal court in Washington, D.C., and we will see if we can get the courts to agree that it is important to protect this sort of thing. And you would think that it is important to protect an AI-generated artwork if you wanted to encourage people to make and use machines to generate creative works. The AI would not own the artwork, of course, both because an AI is not a legal person, so it cannot have rights, and B, because an AI, even though it behaves like a person, is not like a person and is not morally deserving of rights. But the same way that someone owns property made by their own property, like if you own a fruit tree, you own the fruit from the tree, or if you own a 3D printer, you own a physical painting made by the printer, we argue that you should own any property made by your artificial intelligence. You know, I'm running a little low on time, but this is another example from 2019 or earlier from Siemens, which is a large industrial company based in Germany, where the thing on the left in green is a car suspension, and the thing in silver on the right is a car suspension designed by an AI. And the human team involved with this said that they were not inventors because the design came out of an AI. And as a result, the company felt they were unable to get a patent. And so not only is AI making things that would get copyright protection if a person had made it, and AI is making things that could get patent protection if a person had made it. Now, only sometimes people use AI all the time to help in research and development, and it doesn't make it an inventor. But you have some AI that is programmed by hundreds or thousands of people. So it's very difficult to say that something that an AI did is directly related to some specific thing that some programmer did sometimes. And also, there are companies that now sell AI pre-trained and off the shelf to do things like optimize components, like car suspensions. And the programmers may not even know exactly what the AI is being used to do. And at least under US and UK law, that would keep them from being inventors. We filed, again here, a couple of patent applications internationally to try and get the owner of the AI to own inventions made by an AI. And those are filed in 17 jurisdictions now, including Brazil. In July, we had patents issued in South Africa with the AI listed as the inventor and the owner of the AI as the owner of the patents. A few days later, a judge in the Federal Court of Australia held that an AI could be an inventor, and that, at least in our case, the owner of the AI should be entitled to that invention. Last month or 2 months ago now, that judgment was overturned, and we are now attempting to appeal it. Germany's intermediate court held that while you couldn't name an AI as an inventor, you could protect an AI-generated invention. And as long as you named the inventor, the person with the closest connection to the invention as the inventor, you could write in the patent that it was made by a machine, and that would be fine. And that decision is now being appealed to the German Supreme Court by the German Patent Office. We had a Court of Appeals hearing in the United Kingdom where one judge thought we should get a patent and two judges didn't. That's being appealed to the Supreme Court. And we just had arguments in the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit in the United States. I would say they were not terribly receptive to our arguments, so we will see what happens there. And that's just a bit of the many ways that I find interesting that you can have a machine do the same sort of thing that a person can do, but the law treats that behavior very differently. It will even change the standards that we apply to human inventors, because to get a patent, the biggest test is normally what would an average researcher have thought. But average researchers are already using AI now. And so average researchers are becoming more knowledgeable because the AI has the ability to give them access to more useful information. And it's making average researchers more sophisticated because it helps them do things like pattern recognition in large data sets or mass screening, like this is an antibody, many types of antibodies to look at a new condition. And if you believe in this theory of computer science, that computers will continue to exponentially improve until one day they dramatically outperform human beings to such an extent that they can solve all our problems, even the problems we didn't know we had, well, that is going to be a profoundly disruptive thing. But for those of us really interested in patent law, it's going to be interesting for patents too, because that means that effectively the average researcher will be a super intelligent computer, and everything will be obvious to a super intelligent computer. So no person will ever be able to get a patent again. I'll end about there. The book, which is coming out in Portuguese, was recently translated into Chinese, which was, I thought, pretty interesting, but less interesting when The Reasonable Robot, Artificial Intelligence and the Law by Ryan Abbott had become Rational Robots, The Future of Rule of Law and Artificial Intelligence by Ryan Albert. And I didn't mind the Ryan Albert bit so much, but I was concerned that if the title had been mistranslated that badly, that the body of the text probably made little sense. But upon closer observation, I noticed that the human translator perfectly translated the book. It was Google Translate that was automatically translating it back into English and doing it imprecisely. So the AI is not ready to replace the doctors, lawyers, and translators of the world, but it is moving in that direction. And I'll stop here for questions. Thank you.
Pronto, Ana, podemos voltar. Professor, I was going to ask you what I'm positive everyone is itching to ask. You know what it is. About Google. Google AI. Does it have a soul? Is it sentient? And all the questions I'm sure you've been hearing that a lot, but okay, so it's a bit insane. Yeah, so is a bit intense, but is Google's artificial intelligence Lambda sentient?
Well, it's an interesting question, and I think basically three things about it. Firstly, I think for a lot of the purposes, well, let me start with this. It depends a lot on what you mean by sentient. If you mean, does an AI think and feel the way that a person does? The answer is clearly no. An AI can act the way a person does, but it does so for very different reasons than we do. It does so because it has access to large amounts of data that teach it how to respond in a way that is convincing to a person and pass basically what we call the Turing test, which Alan Turing said many years ago when people were asking, do machines think? He said, well, who cares? Because we don't know what it means to think. We don't really know that other people think. And all that we really want are machines that can behave the way people do. And I think that is largely right from a legal perspective, because whether a self-driving car is sentient or not really has nothing to do with what we want a self-driving car for. We want it to drive more safely than a human being. And if it can do that, we want rules that encourage that sort of thing. So I think not in the way that it is being portrayed right now, and it often doesn't matter for the law. But if we ever did have a machine that really was at the level of a human being, not in terms of its capabilities, but in terms of its design, such that it had its own desires and self-interest and self-awareness, that would really be a very different paradigm for us to be living in, because then perhaps a machine would morally deserve rights, and it would be very challenging because that machine could clone itself 7 billion times, and we would have an equal number of sentient machines as people. As far as I understand it, from every technology expert I know, that is still firmly in the realm of science fiction. No matter how much a machine acts like a person, it is not like a person. So if that happens, I'll need to write a new book, but also the robots will write the new book, and I won't probably have to.
That's great. So the Ex Machina image on the beginning of your presentation got our nerves just a little bit agitated. So Mateus Duarte told us in the chat, eager for a future where we can tax AI monkey image generators. We are eager from that too. We have a question from Control to Law Podcast. Quer ler, Rafa? You want to read it? We have a question from Celso.
Let's make this like this. Let the Professor Ryan make some comments about the previous statement.
Eager for a future
it's possible to tax these image generators. The image itself can be taxed. In Brazil, we started taxing the NFTs this year. But the image generators, the AI behind the image itself, it can be seen as a service to be taxed?
Yeah, I mean, this does kind of tie into the next question, which is an interesting one. I suppose it depends on the business model. And yes, the AI per se would not be taxed, but the socially productive output of the AI would be taxed. And that would depend on how you structured the business model for it and what the national tax system was. So, for example, in the United States, if you had a service where I showed you that trademark that I made. If you want to use one of those trademarks, you are supposed to pay $100 for it, which is a lot less than you would pay a person, at least before Fiverr, and we started outsourcing a lot of this. But anyway, if you did pay $100 for that service, that would be taxable activity. Or if you were buying and selling those images, whether or not they were NFTs, those would be taxable transactions in the United States also. We have taxed NFTs for some time. Now, the next question kind of tied into this, which is, some companies are already selling things that they may or may not have intellectual property rights in. And that's interested with distributed ledger technologies, in part because you can essentially set up kind of shadow IP royalty regimes, directly through technology. For example, Europe has an artist resale right for some works of art. So, for example, if I make a sculpture and I sell it for $100, and then 5 years later, an art gallery in France sells it for €1 million, I get, a couple percent of that. Now, they don't have a regime like that in the United States. But with an NFT now, you can have it on a smart contract so that every time you transfer it, some amount of the transfer price goes back to the original wallet that, generated the account. So, these people who are technologically savvy in the NFT space are often philosophically, disinclined to like legal systems, or IP systems, and they don't like or want copyright. And they can set up their own, regimes that are directly technologically unemployed. And some interesting questions arise when you have those systems come in conflict with the law. When you have things like decentralized autonomous organizations, that are functioning through votes of token holders, but where they are doing things like insider trading and fraud and breach of contract, how you enforce those things. But ultimately, all of these technologies depend on people and hardware that is located within some jurisdiction. So there are ways to go after them, and it is an interesting conflict of law and technology.
Professor Ryan, we have no words to thank you for coming here and sharing all this knowledge about this. This subject is very, very, very. How can I say? There are a lot of things that we still have to learn and know about the limits of the artificial intelligence. We don't know where this can lead us in a near future. We are now seeing images being made by programs and people using these images as digital art and making revenue from that, and that is creating a lot of issues about copyrights and other stuff about who is gonna be the owner of that piece of art digitally made by an algorithm. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. If we start to think more and more about how the machine learning and the artificial intelligence is evolution in the last few years, and we still have a long way ahead of us to see where this is gonna lead us. But all I can say is thank you very much. It was a great night and a great explanation, a great lecture. I'm sure that everyone that could see this and could participate asking you questions, it's very fortunate to have this opportunity. Luiz, você quer fazer um fechamento? Que eu já gastei o inglês que eu tinha aqui.
Yes, I just wanted to add a comment sent by my son. Professor Ryan, 22 cats went to court here in Brazil against a condominium that bad treated them. In the lawsuit, the plaintiff cats said that they are animals and subject to rights and therefore have the right to go to court and to stay in the condominium and be fed by the children that live there in the condominium. So you brought that up when you showed us that monkey, and he remembered the news about those cats. And once again, I made the link with the Lambda, the AI from Google. The latest news told us, I don't know if that's true or not, that the AI called a lawyer when it all went up. The employer from Google called his lawyer, and for some unexplainable reason, the Lambda possibly called the lawyer as well. I'm just thankful he remembered to call a lawyer and not a journalist or, I don't know, a game player or whatever. So we are still important. Our profession is still important, and as the AI called the lawyer, not another, representative from, newspaper or anything. So my beliefs in mankind and in AI are renewed. So thank you, Professor Ryan. We are very sorry for our poor English, but I'm sure our students will be able to translate when the simultaneous translation from YouTube is available. More and more students from our university and from Brazil would be able to access all this knowledge you brought to us tonight. So thank you so much. Feel free to come back whenever you want. Our doors are always open.
Well, that would be lovely. I apologize for speaking too quickly. I can barely speak English, and here everyone is listening to a lecture. So that is great. And I share with you, it is great news that the AIs are already looking for lawyers. I am waiting for our AI test case to start paying me in Bitcoin That has gotten cheaper these days, so maybe it will happen. And Professor, it was my great, honor to be here, and I appreciate the invitation, and I would love to see you all in person. And similarly, you are welcome to come to London, and we will not have caipirinhas, but we'll have gin or something. It will be
We'll bring the caipirinhas.
It'll be an honor. Thank you, Professor. E
Thank
pessoal,
you so
quem
much,
acompanhou até agora a live, muito obrigado a todos por terem participado desse webinar. Não deixem de registrar a presença de vocês no QR Code que está aparecendo na tela, para que vocês possam ter acesso à certificação. Tá bom? Muito obrigado, gente. Fiquem todos com Deus. Uma excelente semana. Aos nossos acadêmicos de direito, uma ótima semana de provas e até uma oportunidade. Até mais.